Welcome, champions, to an episode of Idle Champions. Info coming at you quick, fast, and hard. The same way I am in bed. If I ever got any, that is. This time we're not talking about power directly, but speed, which can certainly lead to power in the form of drowning in gems, to spend on gold chests, to gain blacksmithing contracts, to increase the item levels of your champions. To start it all off, we have to talk about these speed champions. Now, I'm not necessarily going to talk about every champion in the game with a speed tag here, just the most important ones. Most importantly, the two sitting all the way at the top in particular. And if you've had some experience with the game or my channel, you probably know who I'm going to talk about. Briv and Hew Maan. Together they are the crutch of speed farming. But why is that? Now, do note, I'm going to talk about a lot of champions coming up. I'll be detailing what they do, but not always in great depth how they're doing it. If you want to know more about that, check out my seat videos where I break down every champion and their kit. With Briv, we're able to entirely jump over zones when you complete one, and this scales to the point of being able to skip over multiple zones. Even just getting him to one guaranteed jump is very important for skipping over bosses in free plays to speed up your progress. But there are jump breakpoints that are very important to reach. The first and most important breakpoint for him is 4 jumps. That means starting at zone 1, you will entirely jump to zone 6, skipping the boss and all of the previous zones entirely. Then from 6 to 11, 11 to 16, 16 to 21, etc. This can be a delicate process, because this scales with the item levels tied to his gear slot for Unnatural Haste, his speed ability. You can get it to land perfectly on 4 zones skipped, but once you exceed even slightly over that, you'll dip into a potential 5 skip. And when that happens, you will mess up that perfect lining up of the 4 jump, meaning you may land on a boss zone and severely slow down your completion time. Thankfully, there is a feat to lock him in a 4 skip once you reach it. But if you ever want to go beyond that, like the mythical 9 skip, to jump over 2 bosses at a time, going, for example, from zone 1 to zone 11, then 11 to 21, you need to perfectly get to 9 skips, and then never give him any item levels again. That means no risking ever opening an Electrum chest that might give him an increase, never opening a weekend chest he's tied to, never doing anything he's involved with in any potential future seasons, nothing. But that 9 skip takes a hell of an investment. And for beginners, a 4 skip is pretty far down the line. For reference, I wasn't even at 4 Jump Briv when I made my Idle Champions overview like 9 months ago, though I did get it shortly after. And I am nowhere near a 9 jump. Now, in order for him to be able to skip an area, he needs to build up his Steelbone stacks, which he consumes on the next run he's in to use with his Unnatural Haste. So there is a balance in how much he needs to be hit in the previous run to translate how far he can skip in the later run. This is important to understand for efficient gem running. Hew Maan is important because these kobolds are tied to enemies having a chance to drop double quest items or count for double quest progress. And again, this can be scaled to exceed 100% to count for even more. So, completing zones much faster, paired with Briv jumping, and you end up flying through the zones. Hew Maan is far less complicated than Briv, as your goal with them is to reach the item level cap with their speed item, the Rainbow Eggs, which for a shiny is 1,615 in this case. Then just be sure they are slotted properly, making Zrang the active kobold, surrounded by as many champions you can within Zrang's position restriction, to scale carefully balanced as high as you can. Then you're set. Now there are some other speed champions you might want to consider, but none are nearly as important as Briv and Hew Maan. Widdle for increasing enemy spawn speed, Nahara and Sentry reducing the quest requirements, which pair well with Hew Maan to have both reduction and quicker completion. And while there are a few other, quote, speed champions, their speed mechanics aren't anywhere near as important as those I've mentioned. And that is part of something else you want to keep in mind, which is lag. Some characters can actually slow down the game, but it can be on a player-to-player basis, based on hardware. The more champions you use, the higher likelihood you are to experience that lag, slowing down your run. A good example of this is Virgil. He is graphic intensive for the game, and while he has a speed mechanic, he seems to be polarizing for whether he helps some people's runs or hinders them. And even someone like Nahara, who is a speed champion I recommend using, for me personally is very useful in a scripted run, but kicks my nuts in a scriptless run. So let's go ahead and talk about how each of those work. And warning, I'm not that efficient. I set something up, look at it, and if it's working, I leave it at that. So when I explain my formations and setups, keep that in mind. Mine are nowhere near fully optimized. Just treat it as a rough guide to get you started. Like a lot of my content, by design, I want to entice you to dip your toes into the pool, so you get the urge to dive in and explore the rest of the depth for yourself. And now another warning, I'm going to talk about scripting. Some people hate it, some people live and breathe it. Codename Entertainment has not condoned it or claimed it against their terms of service, and they even have a channel for it in their Discord. That being said, one day it might be. It's kind of a gray area. I'm only going into it now because they are not openly against it. But if they one day are, let's just ignore everything I'm about to say. First off, we're only going to be talking about Mike Baldy's IC Script Hub. To set it up, you'll first need to get your hands on Auto Hotkey, which is a simple download and install. Mike Baldy's GitHub has a link to where you can download it, and I'll be linking Mike Baldy's GitHub and Auto Hotkey in the description below. After you've installed Auto Hotkey, head on over to Mike Baldy's GitHub and snag that IC Script Hub. And this is the whole purpose for the re-upload. I didn't realize it at first, and it also wasn't brought to my attention as an issue until a little while after I released the video, that I made a bit of a mistake here. In my attempts to make things simplified for people, I made an oversight in my instruction. Normally I'd leave it be and let a pinned comment from Eminem be enough, but it seems to have affected a few people, and while an entire re-upload kinda really sucks for me, I think it warrants it. So, go get the IC Hub script from Mike Baldy's GitHub. There are a few ways you can do this, but I just download the zip and extract the Idle Champions main into a folder that is easily accessible somewhere like your documents or desktop, somewhere other than protected folders like I had previously suggested. I have to say, the inner troll in me really just wanted to say the same thing I said last time. Anyway, back to past Tyredack's so-called content. The first time you open it up, you will need to choose the platform for which you are playing on, and what version. Once you open it up, you will see you have plenty of add-ons at your disposal, like a Jimothy setup or being able to keep track of your Briv farm. Simply reload it to see whatever add-ons you've enabled. It may well be that Mike Baldy's imports are not fully up to date, which will make the script not run properly. Have no fear, simply head over to the Discord in the scripting channel. There is a thread there where the most up-to-date imports are upkept. You may be, just as anyone should be, leery of downloading files from strangers in a Discord. You want to stay careful. Don't just download anything, but generally it should be moderated, and the imports are often done by M-Out, and I think most people, myself included, would vouch for M. But still, be as careful as you choose to be here. Now all you have to do is take that import folder you've downloaded, and overwrite the existing one in your Idle Champions main folder that contains the IC Hub script, which will be located in the Shared Functions, then Memory Read, and there you have it. Now you can do a great many things with this tool, but like I said, I like to keep it nice and simple, and we're just going to be dipping in our toes. And that I'm going to show you my personal Briv setup I let run overnight to farm gems. Many things will vary from person to person. How many jumps does your Briv have? What are your favors at? What speed champions are you using? What item levels are your champion's gear? You're going to need to do some testing on your own to find a comfortable zone to push reliably and where you need to refarm up Briv's Steelbone stacks. This is just my personal setup. It's a bit like getting naked in front of you guys. You're going to make fun of my grotesque You're going to make fun of my grotesque goblinoid form and say, you could do this, or oh, this zone would be better. And to that I reply, gargle my balls. Anyway, first thing is first, you need to set up 3 parties in the first, second, and third star saved formations, or Q, W, and E respectively. You want your Q formation to be the main team for pushing, including Briv. In your W, you want your Briv stacking team, generally just Briv with no familiars on the field. And in your E, you want a team that does not have Briv, usually just the same as your Q but with Briv removed. The reason for this is the script will swap from Q to E right as Briv starts his jump animation, so the jump still takes effect, but will stop the full animation from taking place, making you transition a little faster from zone to zone. Speaking of zone-to-zone transitions, there is something else to note here, and that is that some zones have a quick transition. These are zones that, well, transition quickly, and that is because sometimes from going zone to zone, they will share the same background map, requiring less load time, effectively making that run even faster. So, the adventure you choose to run can have a large impact on how fast that run can be completed. With this in mind, working with my feet using 4 Jump Briv, Tall Tales in the Wild Beyond the Witchlight is the best adventure to run, because zones 11 to 16, 21 to 26, 31 to 36, and then 46 back to the first zone of the area all share the same background map, making for multiple quick transitions in a run. For my Tall Tale run, I set my fast Modron core to reset at zone 550 and auto-load my Q saved formation of my speed team. You could also automate potions, and that brings in another factor to calculate. What is the uptime on speed potions you are using? How far would you have to push to make full use of it? Are you able to farm enough gems to keep them stocked up to justify the persistent use of them? Usually, you'll want to be using click damage for the fastest pace, so you do want at least 1 familiar leveling your click damage and at least 1 on the field actively clicking. Then depending on how far you want to push, find out how far that click damage can take you and go from there. On my script, I have it set to farm Briv's Steelbone stacks at zone 541, just before my reset at 550, because I know that he won't die there in the time it takes to farm up his Steelbone stacks. And he isn't actively killing anything either. In this case, I need this stack to get up to roughly 1,750, but I keep it at 1,800 to be safe. Now, my click damage can push much farther than that, but I like 550 because it's far enough to push with a very light steel bones to stack up to keep the farm flowing. That being said, there is a trick I could be using, in that once Briv is hit and the game is closed, with only a few seconds passing and relaunching the game, Briv will have a lot of stacks already farmed up. In my case, he usually ends up in the 4E4 range, which would allow me to push much farther. The reason I personally don't do that is that in that process is when I've had a lot of errors happen and runs ended. I personally would much rather farm a smaller steel bones without relying on that and just do a shorter run to keep the flow going. But that's just me. I try to require as little from the script as possible, because the more you have it do, the more room for failure there is. I personally use familiars to level my champions instead of relying on the level with F keys, but if you don't have familiars to work with, you'll want to use that. And familiars used to be a bit finicky with FPS, but now that you can lock them into always being at 1x speed, I find them a lot better for stability. And for my run, that's all there is to it. But we still have a very important topic to cover, and that is a scriptless run. So what's the difference between a scripted and scriptless? Well, we don't use a third-party scripting tool for one. We use exclusively in-game mechanics to get as smooth of a run as we can. At the end of the day, it's not going to give the same output of gems, but it can be pretty good if you find that perfect fit. But that takes some hefty tinkering. Let me explain. Scriptless is one of those things that's incredibly simple in concept, but difficult in execution. The whole idea is you're going to form a speed team to push as hard as you can until Briv can get some stacks built up, then push a little further to reset and do it all over again. Now, a big problem with this is that any kind of buff can throw your setup off. If a weekly or weekend party buff comes up for one of your speed champs, that might be enough to skew it. Seasonal buffs will always throw a wrench into how far you can push and what your walls are. That being said, in between my revisiting Diablo 3 for the last hurrah season before the cautiously optimistic Diablo 4 release that I'm going to become a gremlin for, I realized, oh shit, I haven't remade my scriptless formation since Season 2 ended. So my formation is a bit scuffed, but for now it gets the job done. Now I could spend some time and iron it all out and make either a further push with click damage or tinker with it otherwise, but I'm going to wait. We know the next season is coming soon, March 15th, and I'll just need to recalibrate it then anyway. You'll notice a few things. For one, I'm not using click damage. Also, no Nahara, and I've added Dragon Bait? Why is that? Normally I do try to include Nahara, but she has a strange interaction for me when she is my bud-setting champion, in that her damage will linger in a transition and kill enough enemies to push farther than I wanted her to right when I'm closing into my Steelbone stack zone. And sometimes it will break my run because I'll just jump right over it. We don't want that. Why am I not using click damage? Well, using my click damage means I'm going to have to push really far. And that means I need to farm up a lot of Steelbone stacks to make up for that. We're not scripting, and we're going for a fully automated process without script, and that is hard to achieve. Possible, but difficult. So then who am I using as my damage dealer? I'm actually using Shandie, and she's not a DPS. But because she doesn't do what Nahara does, I can now fully control what zone I farm my Steelbone stacks at without using any other champions. So then why do I use Dragon Bait? Well, Dragon Bait is actually the crutch to the entire process, with his scent roasted vegetables. This is a large damage buff to his Shen state, for when either he is being attacked, or per enraged stack. Enraged stacks in a non-boss area only start tracking once you have a full load of 100 enemies on screen. That means I keep Dragon Bait not in the front row, so he's never attacked to proc it, and push up to where I can kill enemies without the proc. Then in that process of building up the max amount of enemies on screen, Briv is being hit and farming up his Steelbones. And once it does reach that point and enraged stacks begin, Shandie will now clear the map because of that damage increase. There are a few other champions you could use for this process. Since I'm not using Nahara, I could also be using Naeli with her aura of protection that works like Dragon Bait. Or Baloth works as an excellent source of extra damage when he saves an ally from death with Generous Jin, and that in fact works quite well when you need to stack a large amount of Steelbone stacks. The problem is my Briv is pretty beefy, so he doesn't die easily unless I push deep. And even when Hew Maan is forced in the front row, like in Tall Tales, he'll still keep Hew Maan alive for a very long time. So I'd have to push a lot deeper to tinker with that and find the right zone to maximize his potential, but still an option to keep in mind. Now, this formation is far from perfect because I'm forced to make a full stop and reach max enemies on screen a couple times in order for Briv to be able to farm up enough Steelbone stacks for the next run. He just barely doesn't on the zone before, but a little overcap is much more suitable for automation than slightly undercapping his stacks, because you never want his jumps to run out and be forced to fight bosses along the way, especially if you're running Tall Tales with lots of armored and crowd-controlling bosses. So I set my speed formation and my reset zone, in this case 711, in my Modron core, and just let that baby run. I only get slowed down right at the end, let Briv stack up, then Dragon Bait procs a damage buff for me to clear that zone and rinse repeat. It could be a better formation, but it's smooth and reliable, and that's what matters to me. And a lot of times, even when you're running smoothly, you're gonna want to check on the run every now and then. Maybe you disconnected and it messed up your run. Maybe something just didn't happen to work right. Every now and then, you might have to tinker. But honestly, once you find the right fit, it's incredibly simple. The complication comes on testing what your own personal limits are with what you have to work with. Again, there is so much depth to be found beyond what I'm showing here. I'm pretty slack when it comes to this side of things, to be perfectly honest. There are going to be people out there saying I'm telling it wrong or suggesting wrong things, and some of them will probably have good points. And a bit of a disclaimer here at the end. All of this is done through the perspective of having a 4-jump Briv. For a lot of beginners, feels out of reach, and for a lot of experienced players have gone far beyond that. But 4-jump is absolutely a goal you should set your eyes on. And if you're not there yet, that doesn't mean you can't gem farm. Even if your Briv only has one jump, you can enable the advanced options within the scripting tool and select what zones you want him to jump and still avoid bosses by only using him at those important moments. And for scriptless one-jump Briv, you just will go somewhere else other than Tall Tales, in favor of an adventure with easy-to-kill bosses when you inevitably land on them. Something without hit-based and without armor. And if you don't care about speed at all in this game, well, I guess this video really wasn't for you, but thanks for sticking around anyway. I'm going to be linking another guide in the description below as well, and that is something I found while working on this video, which is a very in-depth guide to scriptless farming with various strategies of how to do so. It's a lot to read and take in, and I didn't go through everything, but at a glance it seems to have some really good information for those who really just want to dive in. Run a script on that like, sub, and bell for me. Leave a comment on what your speed formations are, scripted or scriptless, and why you like them. But more importantly, have a hell of a time out there, champions.